All right, our third speaker is Chai J. Lo, who is a pianist and PhD candidate at the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music. He was a residential tutor at St. Mary's College, the University of Melbourne, 2019 and 2023, before undertaking postgraduate study in the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. Chai has presented papers at the University of Oxford, University of Aberdeen, at the Musicological Society of Australia National Conference. She is currently a teaching associate in musicology at the University of Melbourne and a member of the editorial committee for Context, Journal of Music Research. Her paper today is Musical Topics as an Interpretive Tool for Variations on Russian Theme. Please welcome Chai J. Lo.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Daniil, for the introduction, and thank you, Larissa, and the conference committee for this opportunity to present. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. So, some of you may have heard of the Paraphrases on a Chopsticks theme, which was composed by Borodin, Cezarkui, Lyadov, Rimsky-Korsakov, Shcherbachov, with a later edition by Liszt that began as an idea to create a duet that was simple enough for Borodin to play with his young daughter on the piano. Or you may have heard of Anton Daideli's variations on his waltz theme that he distributed to every notable composer in his native Austria, with a request to submit a variation as part of a collective set. You may also have heard of the Hexameron, which was first published in 1839. That was composed by Chopin, Liszt, Hertz, Pixies, and Thalberg. And that was based on a theme by Bellini and composed for a benefit concert for Italian refugees. A lesser known work that you may or may not have heard of before is Variations on a Russian Theme, which was composed by 7 composers of the Belyayev Circle and published in 1900 in Venezia, St. Petersburg. So what do all of these works have in common? They are all variation sets. They're all piano works, and they are also collaborative compositions created by multiple authors, where each composer has written one or more individual variations within the set. And variation sets were a common form of collaboration, since a thread of unity was guaranteed by the theme, even if the different composers have distinct compositional styles and methods. And throughout the 19th century, there was a renewed enthusiasm for collaborative variation sets, during which all of these mentioned works were written. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing some of my doctoral research on the piano music of the Belyayev Circle, focusing today on the piece Variations on a Russian Theme. I'll firstly provide some historical background on the Belyayev Circle and this variation set, followed by selected examples of musical topics that I would like to propose as interpretive tools. I will discuss how topical analysis and practice-led research, which form part of my theoretical framework and methodology, can help to enrich the process of arriving at an informed interpretation of Variations on a Russian Theme, accompanied by listening examples from my own recording of the piece. So from around 1882 to the early 20th century St. Petersburg music scene, there was a group of prominent scholars, performers, critics of the time, and composers who were known as the Belyayev Circle, or Belyayevsky Kruzhok, pardon my Russian, and they were named after their musical patron, Mitrofan Petrovich Belyayev. They were the successors of the more well-known Mighty Handful, or Balakirev Circle, also known as the Mogchaya Kuchka, and there were some crossovers in membership between the Mighty Handful and the Belyayev Circle, namely Rimsky-Korsakov and Cezarkui. This photograph was taken of the Belyayev Circle at the 5th anniversary of the Russian symphony concerts in 1900, which were funded by Belyayev. And here we can see Belyayev holding his daughter. To his right, Rimsky-Korsakov, Cezarkui, Stasov, and Lyadov. So unlike the Mighty Handful, Belyayev Circle consisted of conservatory-trained musicians, mostly students or teachers from the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And Richard Turiskin describes this circle as being a bit like a music guild that constantly grew over the course of time, recruiting the newer members from the talented students of the senior members. So many of them were Rimsky-Korsakov's students. And the members of the circle often collaborated in chamber music and composition. They gathered each Friday at Bidayev's home from around 1891. And one of their collaborative compositions was this work. And although some of the composers, as you can see here, are quite well known, they're well studied and familiar today, like Rimsky-Korsakov, Lyadov, and Glazunov. Some of the others who also contributed to this work, like Alexander Winkler, Felix Blumenfeld, and Nikolai Sokolov, are less well known today. Many of their compositions have been forgotten or are rarely performed. And for this particular work, there is only one existing commercial recording. So this brings me to a question that my paper aims to address, which is, without existing studies or established performance traditions of a work like this, how can a pianist such as myself develop an informed interpretation for performance? So to give a bit of background, Variations on a Russian Theme is based on the folk song Malenький мальчишечка, which translates to Tiny Little Boy, found in a collection of transcriptions by Nikolai Abramichev, which were published in 1879. And it consists of songs from the Vyatka province where he was born. And Glazunov also used this tune as the theme in his more well-known work. Some of you may have heard it before, the orchestral work March on a Russian Beat, Opus 76, which was published in 1902. So I'm just going to play the theme here. From speaking with some scholars of Russian descent, I discovered that the lyrics of this folk song have varying interpretations. Some understand it as a lament about a very young boy who cannot decide his own destiny but is forced to follow his parents' choice for who he will marry, while others interpret the text with light-hearted irony. If any of you have a different interpretation of the text, I'd be grateful to hear about it after my presentation, because I'm not a native Russian speaker and I'm really interested to know what other people think. For the piano transcription of the folk song in the piece Variations on a Russian Theme, the major key setting suggests for me that perhaps a character of lament may not be suitable, so I chose to play it in a simple and singable style to prepare for the many thematic transformations to come. This is my recording of the theme. Using Elaine Sussman's definition of variation types, this variation set exemplifies a characteristic variation type, where the individual numbers or variations embody different dance pieces, national styles, or programmatic associations. And to examine these associations more closely, I drew upon Janice Dickensheets' lexicon of 19th century musical topics to identify different topical types and styles in each variation where applicable. Topical analysis deals with referential musical languages and their relationships to each other, creating what Leonard Ratner, who was the founder of topic theory in the West, describes as a kind of informal iconography where figures in music have direct or symbolic meaning, like pictorialism or word painting. And as Dickensheets suggests, topical analysis allows for better comprehension and more accurate recreation of the music. And in this case, my focus will be on performance. Topics can be divided into groups, including types and styles. So we'll define topical types through melodic gestures and rhythmic patterns associated with physical movement, like dances, whereas topical styles will refer to clusters of gestures that together evoke a particular affect or extra musical connotation. In the interest of time, I will just discuss topics that I found in 3 out of the 7 variations within the set. And while I will connect them to performance decisions, I won't go into detail about technical aspects of how I executed them. So one example of a topic is found in variation 3, which is composed by Felix Blumenfeld. And I found that this featured the polka type. The polka was a native Bohemian lively couple dance that reached the height of its popularity in Europe during the 19th century. And since it had been successfully introduced to St. Petersburg during this time, it's not surprising that it was part of the Bidayev Circle's musical vocabulary. So some references to the polka topic that we can see are the characteristic polka rhythms, beginning from the opening rhythmic ostinato in the left hand, the duple meter and rhythmic patterns consisting of quavers and semiquavers with no upbeats. Furthermore, the characteristic dynamic contrast of traditional polka music, which Ivan Izmail-Shlesnevsky, a notable Russian Slavic scholar during the 19th century, described as typically being played either very quietly or very strongly, are also reflected in the large dynamic contrast that Blumenfeld has marked in. And connecting the knowledge of this topic to my own performance, the lively character of the polka shaped the style of my playing. It is also interesting to note that polka music typically has strong downbeats that perhaps reflect its Czech origin, since a defining characteristic of the Czech language is a stress on the first syllable of every word. And therefore, to reflect these strong downbeats, I placed a light emphasis on the first beat of each bar in performing this variation, as you will hear in the recording. In variation 4, composed by Sokolov, the funeral march topical type is evident. Dickon Sheets describes the funeral march as a topic that evokes a funeral cortege procession, usually in duple meter and a minor mode, and all of these are represented in variation 4. Sokolov's use of the grave expressive marking is also suggests the funeral march topic, and it's also interesting that this is the first variation within the set where a minor mode, A minor, has been used. The acciaccatura paired with minim chords in the right hand of the opening section imitate dotted rhythms that often appear in melodic material featuring the funeral march topic. However, in this case, they appear in the accompaniment, which is in the right hand, rather than the left hand melody. I'll just skip forward because I think we're running out of time. So in the final bars of variation 4, the intensity of the triple fortissimo chords, dynamics, thick chordal texture, double dotted rhythms in the right hand, and a repetitive bass line convey a sense of inevitability, along with the diminuendo in the final 3 bars, as you can see, which end on a bass note and an extremely low register, which I interpreted as evoking a sort of descent into death or katabasis in light of the funeral march topic. And in the absence of a tempo marking, my knowledge of the funeral march topic led me to play this passage in a slow tempo to evoke the heavy and somber mood of a funeral march. My final example comes from variation 6, composed by Lyadov, in which I identified the nocturne style topic. As we all know, John Field is credited with establishing the nocturne genre, and it gained significance when Chopin became the leading composer of nocturnes in the 1830s. The nocturne style then took on a topical status once composers started to use it outside of its original genre. And although characteristics of the nocturne style are not necessarily prescriptive to all nocturne compositions, this particular variation is reminiscent of the early nocturne style, which is seen in John Field's Nocturne No. 1, and it's a work that David Rowland suggests to be having features most commonly associated with the nocturne style. So I'll just play a short excerpt from feels nocturne. So these nocturne style features include the very uncomplicated harmony, a basic right-hand melody that becomes increasingly embellished, like vocal fioriture, since the nocturne is a pianistic evocation of a vocal aria. The triplet broken chord figurations in the left hand, as well as a texture that demands frequent use of the sustaining pedal for its effect. In variation 6, these typical features of a nocturne style can be found. And the implications for performance from the nocturne topic are related to the way that it can be expressed. For example, Carl Czerny describes the nocturne as a vocal serenade performed at night, creating an impression of a soft, fanciful, gracefully romantic, or even passionate kind. And with this sort of description, I chose to emphasize the cantabile style of the nocturne in the right-hand melody, while making sure that the left hand was played very lightly to evoke the vocal serenade of the night. Through my practice-led research, I also found that applying una coda with the heavy use of sustained pedal helped to maintain a subdued dynamic and legato phrases to reflect the meditative nature of a nocturne. I also discovered that metrical rubato is particularly suited to the highly expressive cantabile style of a nocturne, since it's similar to the practice traditionally performed by opera singers of rubato against a steady orchestral accompaniment. And therefore, in my performance of this variation, as you will hear, I created a bit of flexibility in the tempo of the right-hand melody to imitate the vocal style line while maintaining a steady pulse in the left-hand accompaniment. Oh, it's very soft. So I hope this presentation has offered a glimpse into how musical topics can be used as interpretive tools in a piece like this variation set. Practice of a piece identifying topics and their connotations using musicological research and topic theory can assist with expressive choices relating to things like tempo, style, and character. And these all form part of the iterative cycle between practice and research, and practice-led research, which is a core part of my own PhD. Thank you for listening.